Welcome students. We have been discussing Indian society on the whole as a concept, and in this lecture we will be looking at the view of Indian villages through the lens of colonial British power. Today, India is closely bound up with national growth as a unified economy, but it has been unified now only as a result of destruction of the former pre-capitalist forms of production that used to prevail commonly all over India. The transition from this system is also mainly due to the advent of colonialism. We shall look closely at the concept being the Indian village and how it was recorded from the perspective of a colonial empire that sought only to use it as a means of production. The village as an autonomous system was based on agriculture carried on with the primitive plough, bullock power and handicrafts utilizing simple instruments and most sustainable in nature. It was an essential feature of pre-British Indian society. It had already been a significant part of Indian society for centuries and survived with only minor modification through the years. The system's impregnability makes it an impressive choice of study when working through the topic of Indian society. An important aspect of history that must be remembered in the Indian village system in all of its fundamentality and its actions before the arrival of colonialization and after it. We shall talk about the same during this session. In this session, we will be looking at British view of the Indian village, Indian feudalism in comparison with European feudalism, nature of village economy in pre-British India, study of the Indian village and the ethnographic tradition in the early 20th century. The British colonial interest in understanding traditional Indian society served as a suitable starting point for further research on Indian society. The studies placed a strong emphasis on improving Indian governance. From 1760 onward, understanding of Indian civilization proliferated after the British arrived. Indian politics and the economy underwent a significant transformation. The arrival of industries signaled the start of the modern age in Indian society among other changes. Posts and telegraphs, railroads, modern education, the expansion of cities, the emergence of new occupations, etc. were some significant advancements that sped up social transformation in India. Particular observations concerning the process of cultural changes and the form of social change in the social system of India can be made in relation to British colonialism. Since the 18th century, according to Bernard Cohn, India has offered a very different social environment than American Indian or African colonies. India had a fully developed agricultural economy, political institution based on kingship, a legal system based on a partially written code, taxation, record keeping and various cultural and religious systems shared by both Hindus and Muslims. In light of this, he contends that the British study of Indian languages was crucial to the control and command mission of colonial era. Today, much of the recorded knowledge about the Indian village is due to the compiled research of the Britishers for their own gain in ruling the colony, and it is crucial to note history as it is. British view of the Indian village. Early in the 19th century, an official perspective of Indian society emerged alongside and surprisingly independently of the official caste concept. According to this perspective, India was composed of village republics which are self-sufficient and corporately organized communities, and Professor Dumont termed it as village community. According to British writers, a village community is primarily a political society. In the second phase, it is a group of co-owners of the land, and in the third part, it represents the traditional economy and polity of Indians. The fifth report of 1812 and Charles Metcalfe's Minutes of the Village of Delhi of 1830 are critically important documents that provide the essential notion and descriptions of the Indian village community. The village community had several consistent elements over time despite minor variations in the subtleties. The community comprises a group of people who share the land and its produce. It is unclear if this applied to the entire community or just the main landowners. All the social and economic choices affecting the town were decided by this body. This is found commonly in North and Central India, and this group is represented by a headman down south. The village Panchayat Council made the decision for and by the village. The village's economy could support itself. The agricultural products supply everything the village needs. This goes on to demonstrate that the village only needed minimal assistance from outside sources to support any of their activities or crafts, since they could maintain the village economy with what was already there. Metcalfe has said in his work that the village system has sustained through the greater part of history when nothing else could last that long, including dynasties, revolutions, and most importantly, their changing masters. The village communities remained the same, according to him, compared to any of the rulers who had control of the village's revenue. The Britishers extensively worked on finding out how the Indian village system existed to develop a theory of rule. This shows why Metcalfe was interested in how the system survived even when whole empires failed to sustain. It is evident through these views that India was economically well off and that the village system, which though primarily pre-modern, was reasonably democratically governed. This system, as the British intended, changed from the self-sufficient village system with the land co-owned by the people to the ideally and stagnated rural economy dominated by moneylenders and the rapacious landlords because of the imperial rule stressed upon it. One of the main reasons for the sustenance of the Indian economy before the British arrival was that the objective and subjective prerequisites that led to the emergence of a national culture did not exist back then. When a national culture starts existing, the community of the body becomes enmeshed into a single system with social, political and economic systems becoming integrated. This national culture also makes the community show hostility towards anything that goes against the development of the nation society, such as the norms that were practiced in a pre-national historical period. This national culture is brought upon by capitalistic economic forms that better suit modern times. The British saw it as essential to bring India under their rule. Breaking the pre-existing system was vital to British Empire's entire India's political foray. Indian feudalism in comparison with European feudalism. Indian feudalism was distinct from European feudalism because it did not recognize individual land ownership. During the Hindu period, any land belonged to its village community and was never regarded as the king's property. The kingdom claimed only a part of the produce coming out of the land, a well negotiated choice with the village community's representative. In this system, the state did not control land ownership. It simply levied a share paid by the village. This system, followed by the Hindu period, was taken with slight modifications when the Muslims started their period. The existing tenures and tax system remained the same with some changes. Since neither the king nor the intermediaries such as zamindars, zagidars or nobles to whom the king granted the right to levy for a particular territory were landowners. All documented disputes between rulers or between them and the intermediaries or between them and the village community have always been only about the size of the share of the village's agricultural output. According to custom and practice, neither the king nor the intermediaries took away the village community's custody and control of the village land, created their own property rights over it, nor expressed any interest in farming techniques. In actuality, the exercise of rights over the village was the main focus of all significant conflicts in Indian history rather than the exercise of rights within the village. There were disputes amongst overlords of different degrees over who had the authority to demand payment from the peasant rather than taking over his land. The conflict between the peasantry and manorial lords, on the other hand, can be seen throughout European history because the latter not only wanted a share of the harvest but also wanted to keep a particular method of cultivation such as forced labor or introduce new methods such as enclosure and large scale farming. The struggle in India was between lords who were more interested in exploiting the people than in the cultivation methods. The struggle was always between various ward claimants with the village and peasantry acting as the passive object of conflict. The produce was the spoil for which the competing powers engaged in combat. It is important to note that feudalism was a social system followed in Europe, but Indian society had a similar scheme involving its villages. B.H. Baden-Powell was an English civil servant in Bengal who served as a conservator of forests in Punjab and as a chief court judge. He has made a massive compilation called The Land Systems of British India, published in 3 volumes in 1892. He defined a village as a group of land holdings aggregated in one place with generally one or more than one group of dwellings situated somewhere in the area, and is everywhere the unit of social life and administration. The compilation is a series of arguments about the nature of Indian village communities in relation to the state, as well as culmination of Britain's interest in studying the social structure of rural India to collect revenue from the land. He recognized 2 claims on the produce of soil. They were the states and the landholders. We have to notice that these villages fall roughly into 2 great classes. The variants being easily recognized as intermediate stages which were distinct in their own origin. One type was called Rayatwari or non-landlord or severality, where each man owns his own holding which he has inherited or bought or cleared from the original jungle. The holders are jointly responsible to the state for revenue or other obligations, and Baden-Powell considered that this type of holding was closely connected with ideas and government. It was found in Madras, the central provinces and Bombay. He traces its origin to Orient times when a chief or Raja was a political leader and had no claim as a landlord, but did have the right to grant individuals the right to settle on wasteland. The second class of villages is characteristic of the northwest provinces, and Powell termed it as landlord or joint village, where there is a strong joint body probably descended from a single head or single family which has pretensions to be of higher caste and superior title to the tenants who live on the caste. This type of village took its origins from the breakup of Raja's estates, grants made to countries by Rajas, the conversion of land grants to revenue officials into a patrimony, and the development of revenue farmers into landowners, and from the original establishment of special clans and families of associated bands of village farmers and colonists in comparatively later times. These landlords did not come together as a community like in the first system, where the village community paid revenue as a single body. This version of autonomy also existed in Indian villages, which is vital to know. Baden-Powell was contrary to Main's study, which showed only one Main placed an evolutionary scheme for Indian village through which its linkages with the West could be established. In his treatment of the process of feudalization, he postulates a transition from village community to the manorial group, which generally succeeds in an evolutionary sequence. The one we have discussed already in the system, with a landlord acting as the intermediary, getting a share of the output. The reason for the British studies on the Indian village is that the Victorian students it as a type that could help them interfere the development of societies from other parts of the world. The Victorians, in short, were not concerned with the actual living condition of the Indian village, but with the general theoretical questions that they could derive use from it back in the day to get categorical and conceptual thinking about the villages. Nature of village in pre-British India. It is now clear that the Indian villages' agricultural production structure was preserved for many years. The ultimate customary ownership claim of the village community over the village land was never contested by an emperor or viceroy. No matter who ruled the autonomy of the village, land lay with the village itself because the state dabbled only in a part of the agricultural produce as revenue. Indian people are distributed in numerous and autarkic village centers, each being a closed system with very little social, economic or intellectual exchange with the outside world, remained cramped, did not grow. The village agriculture produced and catered to the needs of the village. A share of the produce had to be surrendered to the current ruling state, but otherwise the agricultural produce was consumed locally by the peasants and the non-peasants. While the peasants were the primary source for agricultural work, the general village population also contained industrial workers. These industrial workers, such as smiths, carpenters, potters, cobblers, etc., existed in the system to cater exclusively to the needs of the village population in general. Apart from the peasantry and the industrial workers, there were also exist other classes of people who are menials who did scavenging at outcasts, since most of them are the descendants of aborigines who were absorbed into the Hindu class system as avarnas instead of being exterminated from the system. It is important to note that all the services offered inside the village were restricted to the village's use alone, which shows as the limited scope of what was produced and consumed in the village. The low stage of the division of labor and inadequate segmentation of agricultural and industry were other characteristics of village economy. For instance, the farmer's family also participated in domestic spinning, while the artisans worked in the agriculture for a certain period of the year. The village community prospered in its autonomy since they were self-sufficient regarding any raw materials they could need to sustain their way of life and its industrial use. These jobs were not mutually exclusive. The village people survived for generations on self-sufficient local agriculture and industries, maintained utilizing their rudimentary method. With unsophisticated machinery forming the bulk of the system, the bullock cart was the chief means of transport in pre-British India. Due to its almost total isolation from the outside world and the absence of meaningful social interaction, the autarkic village remained an impregnable bastion of the same static, stereotypical social existence for many centuries. Land-hungry invaders only sporadically disturbed this tranquil existence. Another feature of the village society was the rigorous, almost inexorable force of caste which dictated each individual's line of work. Because heritability was the foundation of castes, occupations followed suit. Additionally, no individual initiative, adventure or forging of new paths could be developed in the community due to the caste system that governed its social structure. The villager believed that the caste system had been divinely ordained, obediently obeyed all of its rules and taboos, and quietly accepted the rank and role that the God-made caste system had allotted to him in the village social and economic structure. Throughout its long history, pre-British Indian society almost totally regarded the individual as subject to the caste, the family and the village panchayat. The villager continued to be governed by the caste and village committees and courts. The person scarcely existed unless they were a part of a larger group. Only within the parameters set by the village was self-determination a feasible option. The village was simply a part of larger social structure. The state had the legal authority to govern it, albeit it rarely did so because it has more of an economic and administrative organization. Study of the Indian village and the ethnographic tradition in the early 20th century. The famines and the scarcities from 1765 to 1858 and widespread riots in the Deccan in 1875 and the concern over the land alienation resulted in the spate of official investigations by the Special Commission. The tendency in the reports and in the use made by the Indian and British critics was to aggregate the statistics and findings of the specific studies so that attention was directed to macroeconomic and social problems. Despite some knowledge being gained, work of the economic and social structures of villages were still ignored. In the early 20th century, Dr. Harold H. Mann, principal of the College of Agriculture at Pune, was responsible for directing two studies of the actual functioning of the village economics in Deccan. The two studies gave a good summary of the topics covered in the surveys. Physical features of the village, which includes rainfall, geology, soil, etc., the land and its divisions, tenures, history of the land revenue, land holdings, etc. Vegetation, crops and cultivation, which includes all the crops, are noted with brief descriptions of methods of cultivation, amount of village land under the crops, value, etc. Agricultural stock of the village, that is the number and kinds of animals and value. The people of the village, that is the brief description of the castes, their activities and extensive discussion of their income and expenditures. The surveys did give in graphic fashion a detailed picture of the functioning of the village economies, though the data were unreliable and not comparable. Ethnographical and physical anthropological components were included in the census operation. LSS O'Malley, EAH Blunt and JH Hutton worked on the census data and produced books on the caste system. An ethnographic study was done in the northeast of India by Hutton, Mills and Ortson, who produced as government ethnographers extensive account of major Naga tribes. Seligman did a study of Veda of Ceylon, Rivers did his famous study of the Todas, and Ratcliffe Brown his study of the Andaman Islanders. The most active ethnographer of the period was a civilian, that is Sarath Chandra Roy, who carried out a series of important studies in Chota Nagpur on the tribals of that region. It was through Roy's energy and skill that Man in India was founded and thrived. Now we came to the last part of our program, that is summary. The number of studies done on the Indian village by Britishers is many, but they have used and applied for a similar cause, to take control of the revenue that comes from India's biggest income generator. They took political control of India after the Battle of Plassey, but the economic control needed much more insight to work on, since the Indian system of revenue was majorly different from that of British tax system. They had to work on a way to remove the autonomy from the Indian villages to make them dependent on that empire and collect profits from them. They had no other motive for being concerned about the Indian village but for resources and power. Even if looking back at history demonstrates that the Indian village economy was self-sustaining, it is also not the most stable of livelihoods, because the rules of personal life were set by the common belief systems such as caste and religion, rather than by the individual. There can be no comparison between then and now, because there are practices that are illegal today that were widespread before. But it does not change the fact that colonialism gave rise to the India of today. We are taught to learn from our mistakes and work toward a more sustainable future via anthropology, sociology and history. Thank you.